Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Jude Ilo, CEO of the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, and his team for the very kind invitation to be here for these very timely conversations on why justice matters, and also for their very generous hospitality since we arrived here in The Hague. I also, Jude, must thank you very much for the very inspirational opening. And I think that, frankly, I should really just take my seat after all that you have said. And I think you've given some of the very best examples of what happens when justice fails. But I'll still begin with the obvious fact that the cost of lack of access to justice is staggering, and it is borne not in the courts or in the legal textbooks, but in the lived realities of ordinary people everywhere across our societies. So we find that millions of people, especially in developing countries, live outside the protection of the law. Their land is taken, wages are withheld, their rights are violated, yet frequently they have no meaningful recourse. Their silence, as we've heard, may not necessarily make the headlines, but the cost of their exclusion is felt in every sector of our society. The economic cost is immense when contracts are not enforced and informal traders and micro-entrepreneurs operate in the fear of extortion or seizure of their goods, like the young man in Tunisia by government officials. Local investments shrink, and poverty becomes permanent. The social cost is visible when people turn to violence or vigilante justice because they have no access to functioning, credible institutions. The gendered cost is also profound when women who report abuse or widows claiming inheritance are met with indifference or with bureaucracy. Inequality becomes institutionalized. And of course, the political cost is dangerous. When justice appears to serve only the powerful, democracy becomes fragile and citizens' engagement simply withers. But above all, there is a moral cost, and I think Jude made the point so well. A quiet and corrosive erosion of human dignity. To be denied justice is simply to be told that your pain is irrelevant, that your rights are conditional, and that your existence is negotiable. During my tenure as Attorney General in Lagos State, and the Attorney General in the state is also the Commissioner for Justice under the governorship of the present President of Nigeria. Lagos State, for those who do not know, is Nigeria's commercial capital and its most populous state. We have something close to 20 million people who live in that state. We confronted some of these challenges with what at the time we were certain was a comprehensive reform agenda, which we developed with civil society and several organizations involved in the justice and governance sectors, and the Nigerian Bar Association. We realized in more specific terms that the lack of or perhaps poor access to justice conceals several terrible hidden costs. For example, we realized that while the state, that's the government, provided a directorate of public prosecutions to prosecute persons who are accused of crimes, and that's a traditional department in the Ministry of Justice, the vast majority of accused persons charged before our courts simply could not afford the cost of legal representation. Besides, even before being charged to court, they had no legal representation as the law required at the point of arrest and interrogation. So the Constitution provided that you were entitled to legal representation at the point of arrest or interrogation, but that obviously was not possible if you couldn't afford it. So many were in court who had made admissions or confessions that they would claim were induced. And so aside from the very massive work done by human rights groups, which still only amounted really to a drop in the ocean when you compare to the number of persons who were in need of legal defense, it became obvious to the government that we had to provide legal assistance. So the government had to pay, as it were, for legal assistance. We created an Office of the Public Defender, a unit in the newly created Directorate of Citizens' Rights. And this office deployed lawyers for legal defense of indigent accused persons. Later on, we started a duty solicitor scheme. And the duty solicitor scheme was established again in collaboration with civil society groups. Now, these were lawyers who made the rounds in police stations and detention centers to assist arrested and detained persons. So their business really was to make the rounds wherever, in whatever police stations or prisons where people may have been held, and their business was to assist in the process of ensuring that the rights of these persons who were detained were adequately addressed. A major issue that we had to deal with was determining who was indigent. And we did not have a predetermined threshold for indigence. In other words, there was no means test as such. So now this enabled us to be flexible in determining who to assist and who not to assist. But a bigger problem was legal assistance to indigent litigants in civil cases. And these were, of course, far more than criminal cases. There were thousands of cases of tenants who were evicted from rented apartments and without due process. There were inheritance and succession claims, especially from widows who, on account of some of the draconian widowhood practices, some of which Jude had alluded to, and being overpowered by relatives of deceased husbands who could not access their rights. Also, there was a major deterrent against, for instance, medical negligence claims is usually the threat of legal actions against medical practitioners or hospitals. But for a vast majority of citizens who suffered some kind of negligence and were victims of medical negligence, it was simply not affordable for them to engage legal counsel. Indeed, a major tactic of individuals and organizations was to take indigent persons to court, knowing that they would not be able to afford the legal costs of any kind of long-drawn litigation, and so force them to abandon their claims or rights. Even delays in the justice system mean that the most vulnerable will be unable to bear the cost. So in response, we expanded the mandate of the public defenders to include all civil cases. And this was important because it enabled the state to support indigent litigants in establishing their civil claims against individuals, against corporations, and even against the government or its agencies. Landlord and tenant cases were particularly numerous. They were literally in the thousands. Magistrate courts, of course, had jurisdiction in many of such cases. But the magistrate courts were very slow in resolving these disputes. And this led to two consequences. First, landlords who followed legal due process could be held in court for years, during which time they received no rents. Now, when the cases were finally decided, enforcing their claims for accumulated rent was usually too difficult, so they often abandoned their claims for accumulated rent. Now, these delays discouraged private investment in middle to low-income housing, and the state noticed that its housing stock was actually diminishing as private persons invested in other things rather than invest in houses, especially low-cost houses, which obviously were in great need when you consider the population. The second consequence of the delays in court processes before the magistrate courts was in landlord and tenant cases where tenants were unable to seek redress against landlords who evicted them without due process. So we established the citizens mediation centers, Now, the objective was to make mediation services accessible, beg your pardon, to all, especially for small claims. So the mediation centers had trained mediators, mostly lawyers from the Ministry of Justice, and some non-lawyers. So at the end of a successful mediation, a binding and enforceable agreement is signed by the parties. Now, this achieved considerable success. And one of the reasons why it was so successful was because parties could simply come before a mediator and tell their stories, as it were, and then reach some kind of compromise, especially as to liability and all that. And the mediators were trained in the law, so they were at least able to guide the parties and ensure that at the end of the day, some kind of consensus was reached. In 1 year, we were able to resolve over 8,000 landlord and tenant cases, and the magistrate courts were, of course, barely able to complete 2,000 cases within the same period. And since then, over 20,000 cases are resolved every year. There are now about 18 such centers in the state, and I think that's probably even more now, each housing a number of mediators. And of course, the services, as I've said, are free. We also upgraded infrastructure. We digitized court systems, we improved case management procedures, etc. We improved the condition of service for judicial officers, and we worked hard to reduce delays in the adjudication processes. Now, these efforts led to measurable improvements. Court efficiency increased, more people accessed legal aid, and a culture of awareness, of rights awareness, rights, civil rights, as well as economic and political rights, began to grow. And Lagos became, in many ways, a national model for justice sector reform. But with all these gains, there was a disquieting realization. We were improving the system, but the system itself was not designed to meet the justice needs of the majority. Our reforms, while they may have been described as progressive, were still rooted in an orthodox, institution-centered framework. They improved what existed, but they could not fully reach the vast majority of the population who were living in informal settlements, who were working in the shadows of the economy, or navigating customary systems that were far removed from the courthouses, and in many cases from the mediation centers, especially where those were located in the urban areas. Because fundamentally, the justice system that we were reforming was not necessarily built to serve the poor, the vast majority of the bottom of the pyramid. It reflected the broader development paradigm that shaped it, one that was really top-down, exclusive, and structurally detached from the everyday experiences of people that it claimed to protect. My tenure as Attorney General ended in 2007. In 2008, the groundbreaking report, and I'm sure many here might be familiar with it, Making the Law Work for Everyone, that was the title of the report, by the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, funded at the time by the UNDP, was published. It highlighted what we all suspected: the exclusion of billions of people from the rule of law and substantial justice. And in response, the report proposed 4 pillars for legal empowerment of the poor, which the Commission argued would enable those living in poverty to become partners in, rather than passive recipients of development programs. And these 4 pillars were access to justice and the rule of law, property rights, labor rights, and business rights. This was the birth of the people-centered justice approach to the conceptualization and delivery of justice. Let me just do a very quick summary of the thinking behind the approach before I make some concluding points. The people-centered justice approach represents a fundamental shift in how justice is understood and delivered. So rather than focusing on formal legal institutions, it starts with people's real-life needs, especially those in marginalized communities. The most radical feature of the approach is the reframing of justice as a public service. So much like health or education, justice then must be available, must be accessible, must be affordable and effective. Now, this simple redefinition changes everything. That justice is actually a service, it's actually a commodity, it's actually a sort of service, an essential service, as you would have education, as you would have healthcare. And this, of course, has to be delivered through community-based platforms like mobile courts, legal clinics, not just the formal courts. The second point is the problem-solving focus, that people-centered justice prioritizes resolving people's actual justice issues over legal procedures. And the third point is that it is demand-driven. It starts with people's needs and then perceptions also, not institutional assumptions. The fourth is the synergy of formal and informal systems, working with local customary justice mechanisms while aligning them with human rights. And then the fifth is the promotion of legal education and early intervention to prevent injustice. The sixth feature of this people-centered justice is the intentional use of evidence to design responsive, targeted solutions. And the seventh, is inclusive governance, encouraging community involvement in justice system designs. And this is a very important feature, encouragement of data in designing justice systems. And that obviously always throws up what the fundamental problems are. Because once you look at the numbers and those who have been served, you can very easily tell whether you're doing the right thing or not. Now, ultimately, this model aims to transform justice from an elite institutional process into a practical, participatory service that strengthens dignity, inclusion, and equity. I think the insights provided by the report and the development of the people-centered justice approach radically reframed the thinking of many reformists working on justice sector development or reform, especially in developing countries. And certainly it influenced and reframed my own thinking and those of colleagues in the Justice Research Institute. There's a large number of innovative work also that's been inspired by this paradigm, that's been done by several different organizations. So let me conclude with a few learnings so far. The first learning, I think, is that only a people-centered system of development can give rise to a truly people-centered system of justice. And I'd like to repeat that to have a people-centered approach or paradigm for justice, it must be set within a people-centered paradigm of development. Because a people-centered paradigm for development is one that places the needs and voices of the vast majority, particularly those at the bottom of the pyramid, at the core of policy and planning. So instead of privileging the wealthy elite in hopes that the benefits will eventually trickle down, this approach insists that economic decisions directly prioritize improving ordinary people's lives. Advancing a people-centered development agenda, especially in developing economies then, would require a decisive shift in policy frameworks from the trickle-down orthodoxies to a more bottom-up, a more inclusive strategies. So budgeting and fiscal policy, for example, would explicitly prioritize investments in the well-being of the poor majority, rather than assuming that the benefits will seep down, and that, of course, means that government need to shift towards direct investments in the economic self-reliance and resilience of the poor and vulnerable people. So, for example, funding for rural healthcare, public education, and, of course, justice systems planned around the real social and economic circumstances and needs of the majority need to be put in place. So there is an intentional effort to ensure that even in budget and planning, we're taking into account the actual justice needs of the vast majority of people, and that is a fundamental part of the entire budgeting and fiscal policy process. The second is that a people-centered model isn't just about improving access to the law. It's about transforming the relationship between people and power. It seeks to build justice systems that are trusted, that are understood, and used, especially by those who need them the most. So it replaces, in some senses, silence with a voice, invisibility with inclusion, and exclusion with fairness. I believe that this is really the future of justice because it speaks to the needs of the largest numbers, it is practical, it is responsive, and it is fundamentally just. Thank you very much.